Hi guys, our lesson today will be about conservation, why and how. Over time, the variety of life has become extensive, but it's now being threatened by human activity. And we are going to evaluate the methods used by zoos and seed banks to conserve the endangered species and their genetic diversity. We are going through some terminology like reintroduction programs, education, captive breeding, and scientific research. We all know that all over the world, people are constantly taking resources from the biosphere. Global ecosystems supply food, water, building materials, clothing, medicines, and more for the global population. As human population gets ever larger and we take more from the environment that we need, biological resources are being increasingly depleted. The extinction of species and the loss of biodiversity in many areas of the world are clear examples of human influence on the wide range of ecosystems. So just we can summarize the human contribution to global warming and for the wide range of ecosystem by his breeding, multiple use of electricity, the extensive use of cars, and the exhaust gases coming from cars, the human waste, including biological and non-biological waste, growing rice, keeping cattle, because keeping cattle, it was found that produce large amount of waste and ammonia, and ammonia has a very big contribution to global warming, taking resources from the biosphere. Look at this graph. It shows you the growth of human population over years, starting from 1050 until 2017. You can see that the population wasn't exponentially increasing until 1750, and then there was some higher rise in the population growth, but now it's exponentially increasing from 1850s until now. And what is the reason behind the human population explosion? We can say the farming machinery and fishing machineries, development of medicines and engines. Of course, the influence of the human on ecosystem has affected the biodiversity. So now the biodiversity has been reduced. Why the biodiversity is being reduced? Of course, this is a very long question, but we can just give a brief list for some of the reasons that lead to reduction of the biodiversity through human activities, such as overfishing, habitat destruction, and climate change. Human threats to biodiversity. So how does human affect or make a threat for the biodiversity? We are going to focus on two main factors. First is climate change, and second is depletion of biological resources. Climate change, you know that now the atmosphere temperature is being rising over the last decades. So there will be a global temperature rise, increased number and frequency of extreme weather events all over the world, like hurricanes and other events that happen in the atmosphere around us, periods of tropical heat and desertification. This led to, as for so many plants and animals, are no longer survive. Then for the effect of human on the depletion of biological resources, you know, a human has impacted a lot on our biological resources by eating more food than they need. This lead to depletion of the biological resources, destruction of the land and the ocean. We can take an example here for the human threat to the biodiversity, the illegal logging operation in rainforest. Like the people were using a technique that we call it a slash and burn. They were cutting down trees, all the trees, burning the ground afterwards. So they leave the ground blank area so they can clear the soil for farming and harvest the wood to sell. The soil is soon exhausted and the biodiversity lost because many of the organisms, many of the creatures that were taking trees as their habitat for them, the habitat is lost, so the biodiversity also lost. So, as being biodiversity is being reduced through human activities such as overfishing, habitat reduction, and as a result of climate change, so many people now around the world are working hard to reduce these trends and to conserve the biodiversity we still have. This can be tackled in many different ways that we summarize them in one term. We call it conservation. What is conservation? Conservation aims to keeping and protecting a living and changing environment. It involves many products involving reclaiming depleted land. So the land which is depleted, we try to make it again a rich area, more fertilized area to be cultivated or to grow trees again, sustainable agricultural system, protection of single threatened species, global legislations on population level, and the gas emission in what we call greenhouse gases. So the world is working to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Conserving animals and plants. We have two types of conservation, ex situ conservation and the in situ conservation. Ex situ conservation means conserving animals away from their natural habitat or outside their natural habitat, like keeping the animals in zoos or keeping plants in seed banks. While in situ conservation is conserving the species of animals in their natural habitat. So we can isolate some species, but within the same habitat. Don't remove the animals from their habitat. Now we are going to compare and take some examples for ex situ and in situ conservation. Ex situ conservation means the conservation of the component of the biological diversity outside their natural habitat. The components of biological diversity, we mean living organisms. So how this happen? When the organism is threatened with extinction, some animals or plants are removed from their natural habitat. And then they will be kept in a place like zoos or seed banks, and this helps to conserve their genetic materials. At least we are keeping what we have. We are not going to lose the genetic diversity that we have so far. And it was proven that after a period of time, the breeding population can return to their natural habitat. So after a period of time, when they increase in number and they become successful reproducers, we can reintroduce them in their natural habitat. Normally we are not fixing only on ex situ conservation because it won't be successful unless it's accompanied by the in situ conservation. So they go parallel to each other in the same time. We can focus on some examples of the ex situ conservation, crossbreeding. So when the animals are conserved, when they are kept in zoos or seed bank or captive breeding program, so crossbreeding can take place for example, for crop plants, and then they will be back to their original wild plants, using wild plants to supply genes for genetic engineering. So while genes are very good source for genetic diversity that can be used later on for genetic engineering. In botanic gardens, for example, threatened and endangered species are collected and conserved inside the UK and in the whole world. Inside the seed bank, live seeds are collected from the wild, and then we should screen them by X-ray to make sure they contain fully developed embryos. And then we dry the seeds, pack them, store, at very low temperature, -20 to -40. It was proven that this very low temperature, together with very low humidity, will depress the growth of the embryo. So the embryo will not develop to make a complete plant, but it will stay vital. This doesn't alter the genetic material or the vitality of the living organism. So we can summarize the advantage of the seed banks as follows. One, seeds can be collected without damaging the natural population because you are collecting the seeds from the wild. While there are so many plants there, most of the seeds are normally lost to the atmosphere without being used in the process of germination. So if we take some seeds and collect them, we are not going to alter the natural population density. Secondly, large number of seeds can be stored quite cheaply in a small place. So if you store seeds, it will be more reasonable and more cost effective than when you preserve the whole plant. A record of genetic material makeup or genetic makeup of the species will be kept. So we have like a data for all the genetic makeup of all species of the plants that are existing so far in the world. 4, potential new plants for the future. So we have a new plant that can be used in the future if we have any point of extinction or another species of plants become endangered or threatened. So we still have a genetic makeup of all the species, so we can reproduce the plant again. And now people are able to have 80% of the species are well known and could be stored in seed banks. But it was found that some species of plants cannot be grown or cannot be stored in the seed bank, like some crop plants, like also mangoes, rubber, and many other examples of plants that cannot be stored in the seed bank. They don't store well, or they can get deteriorated quickly. The vitality of the organism is not kept with the same, the genetic makeup is affected, so they may be grown in situ instead. So we can keep them in like plantations on orchards or in a tissue culture, but leave them in situ, don't remove them from their habitat. In this case, a lot less space and time are needed and allow more varieties to be conserved. In Exeter Conservation of animals, like zoos, we can keep animals in zoos. You know, now initially zoos were built only for entertainment and for people to go and see animals. But now zoos and wildlife parks are used for captive breeding programs. What are these programs? These are programs where individuals of an endangered species are bred in zoos and parks in an attempt to save the species from extinction and, if possible, to reintroduce them to their natural wild environment. So animals are captured and transferred to the zoo, and then inside the zoo they will have suitable mates, and records of breeding are kept in stud books, so we can have records for their successful breeding stories. 2, inter-zoo animal movement is encouraged to avoid inbreeding. So we allow the animals to move and between zoos. So this helps to avoid inbreeding, because the inbreeding will have like a succession or a depression on the genetic makeup or genetic diversity. Modern techniques may be used to provide multiple embryos, such as IVF. This is what the zoos and the captive breeding program can afford for the conserved animals. Then animals are prepared for reintroduction into the natural habitat through 1, reinforcement of the wild behavior by hacking off reducing food to encourage hunting. 2, selection of the suitable habitat or natural reserve. 3. Raising awareness of the local population about the risk of extinction and the risk of human activities on biodiversity, increasing this risk like illegal hunting and trading, like putting laws to not allow hunting and trading, problems with captive breeding and reintroduction program. There is not enough space or sufficient resources in zoos and parks for all endangered species. 2. It's often difficult to provide the right conditions for breeding, even if the scientists know what those conditions are. For example, it's well known that giant panda is difficult to breed, even when conditions are ideal. 3. Reintroduction in the wild will be unsuccessful unless the original reason for a species being pushed to the edge of extinction is removed. 4. Animals that have been bred in captivity may have great problems in adjusting to unsupported life in the wild. 5. When the population is small, the gene pool is reduced, and this can cause serious problems. Zoos try to overcome this by keeping detailed records of the genetic data for their breeding individuals. Sperm can be swapped with other zoos for artificial insemination to maximize genetic variation in offsprings. Reintroduction programs can be very expensive and time consuming, and they may fail. Sustainability, how to get a sustainable environment. We are going to classify the sustainability in 3 points of view: sustainable forestry, sustainable agriculture, and sustainable tourism. Sustainable forestry is to harvest trees and selectively and replanting them for the future. 2. Sustainable agriculture. This includes using organic fertilizers, minimizing the use of chemical pesticide and artificial fertilizers, using biological pest control, maintaining hedgerows, and rotation planting not to exhaust the soil. While sustainable tourism, it does minimize damage to the environment, provide jobs and money for the local people, and also conserve the environment. This also helps to maintain the biodiversity at the same time. Large-scale farming. What do you mean by scale farming? Scale farming is a small-scale agriculture which aims to produce crops and livestock on a small piece of land without using advanced and extensive technology. What does it aim to? It aims to provide food with sustainable methods. It improves crop yield and economical yield. It's cheaper on a large term and also better for the environment. Then, what is the importance of education in maintaining biodiversity? Why it's very important to educate people to know more about biodiversity. The impact of human activities on the natural world is obvious for everyone. Ways in which people can interact or act to protect animals, plants, and habitats should be learned and be very clear for everyone. People learn about the damage they can do with their environment and want to change or want to help. People in zoos and natural parks see animals, recognize the threatened species by the human behavior. Now we are going to solve some checkpoint questions. Question 1, preservation means preserving something exactly that is now. Explain how conservation differs from preservation. Conservation involves keeping and protecting a living and changing environment. It's dynamic and encompasses change, whereas preservation is static and keeps things exactly the same. So preservation, like if you preserve a specimen of sample of a heart or a lung, so you preserve it, so you keep it in the way it is. By conservation, it's a dynamic process because it involves changing the living environment, changing the gene diversity, changing the gene pool, so they are completely different. 2. Explain the difference between ex situ and in situ conservation. We said in-situ conservation, it takes place in the natural habitat of the organisms, while the ex-situ conservation is conserving the living organism away from its natural habitat, often in a different country. Also, we can add here ex-situ conservation can be used to support the in-situ conservation in the following ways. Organisms can be removed from breeding in a safe environment and then return to the wild in the what we call the reintroduction program to support the organism being conserved in situ. Ex situ conservation can increase the gene pool of the dwindling wild species or wild population. Ex situ conservation can keep the numbers going until such time as in situ conservation is viable. Question 3. Explain why it's much easier to conserve plant biodiversity than animal biodiversity. So here you should compare how conserving plants is much easier than conserving animals. So going for plants, plants can be conserved as seeds. Seeds, they are very small in size, take very small space, easy to manage, to store at very low temperature and very low humidity. They can stay alive or viable for a very long period of time. Over all of that, plants make many seeds, so collecting few of them will not harm the population number. When cooled and dried, most seeds will last several hundred years. And if not seeds, if the seeds were not available or the plants cannot be conserved as seeds, we can have other program of plantation program like tissue cultures can be conserved that will produce more plants when desired. These techniques don't take up much space and are not very expensive on the long run. Animals are much harder to conserve. DNA is being conserved, but so far we have no way of bringing that back into being a living animal. So even if we conserve the DNA, we don't have the technique, or the technique is not successful until now to have an animal from DNA. Conserving and breeding whole animals is very expensive, takes up a lot of space, and very time consuming. Question 4. Question 4 is asking to discuss the main advantage and disadvantage of captive breeding and reintroduction programs. The advantage can be summarized as follows. It helps save some of the rarest animals and plants. Some species have been saved from extinction and returned to the wild, so we have a successful story about this. Genetic variety can be maintained as much as possible to support captive breeding and wild populations. While the disadvantages can be summarized as follows. Ecosystem, once lost, may never be restored. Animal may not have somewhere to return to, so reintroduction to the wild becomes impossible. Animals are expensive to keep. It's difficult to provide right conditions for breeding. Animals bred and fed in captivity may be unable to adapt to life in the wild. Expensive reintroduction program may fail. Okay, and some other reasons you may expect here. Now we are done with our lesson. Thank you. In the next video, we are going to start solving past paper questions. Thank you.